Hi, it's Mark and welcome back to No Book Left Behind, and today is my December reading roundup, a mini disaster featuring vampires, mythological gods, ghosts and Frankenstein. So, why was my December reading month a mini disaster? Well, simply put, I forgot about Christmas. Yes, I forgot that I'd be going away for a while and that would affect how much I'd be able to read, but more importantly, what I'd be able to read. Because I'm a guy who travels light and I had a long way to go. So I took my Kobo and was reading digital books for that period, not physical ones. And of course, if you go back to my December TBR video, I named 9 physical books and 1 digital one. So that balance did kind of cause a bit of a problem. And it did mean that I only finished 4 books of those 10 books on my TBR. But it wasn't all disaster. I did get a chance to still read 6 whole books. Yeah, just 6. Okay, it's not that bad, is it? But for someone who's put himself on a book buying ban for the new year, until he reads 100 books off his TBR, that 6 total does take on a bit of a different view, doesn't it? Because it does look like if that's all I'm going to be able to manage, I'm only going to be able to do, 72 books this year? Almost said next year. This year, it's 72 books. So I'm going to be stuck in this book buying ban for about 18 months at this rate, which is not ideal by any means, is it? And when I actually looked back and counted out how many books I'd read over the entire year, most of which took place before I started the channel, the total was only 58. So that's even worse. Okay, well, I'm going to make an effort to read more this year. That's what I'll do. Anyway, let's get on to the actual books I managed to read in my December reading roundup. So firstly, we'll go on to start with the digital books. And we'll begin with Shake a Crooked Town by Dan J. Marlowe. Now this is the 5th of the books he wrote at the beginning of his career, featuring Johnny Killane, the night manager of a New York hotel who gets involved in various murders, mayhem, criminal activities and femme fatales. And this was the last of the series, which had begun I think a couple of years earlier. And as I say, this was the 5th entry. Now in this entry he's visited by Carl Thompson, the ex-police chief of a small upstate New York town. He's been kicked out of office by a criminal syndicate which is now running things, and he wants Johnny to come back with him and give these criminals a dose of their own medicine. Now Johnny originally refuses this request simply because Thompson comes over as, well, semi-deranged, possibly paranoid, certainly unstable. But Johnny thinks enough of the story to put in a call to an old army buddy of his who now is a big wheel in Washington and happens to be Thompson's brother. But later on that evening, Johnny goes back to his hotel room and finds that Thompson's there again. Only this time he's very much dead and someone has called the cops. Now I feel that the Killane books that Marlowe wrote at the start of his career are fine, pulpy entertainment. Nothing very special, notable or outstanding, but good time passers. They're thrillers filled with punch-ups, gunplay, femme fatales, double-cross and triple-cross, all happening at a real furious pace, so that you don't tend to notice too much just how generic it all feels. There's little depth to any of it. Killane's handy with his fists, handy with a certain other part of his anatomy. And this all brings to mind Mike Hammer in his early days, written by Mickey Spillane, but without that kind of stylish prose and immediacy that Spillane was able to bring to those stories. I thought this last entry was a tad better than the previous one, The Fatal Frails, which I thought was the weakest of the series, but it's about on a par with the first 3. There's not much to choose between any of them, really. They're decent enough thrillers, decent enough time passers, just nothing very memorable. Now, moving on to the second book in my monthly roundup, this is The Canary murder case by S.S. Van Dine. Now, after helping the authorities out with the Benson murder case, art fancier and man about town Philo Vance is called in again to help when a Broadway performer known as the Canary is found brutally strangled in her apartment. Now, the Canary had been involved in many relationships with some highly influential men, and it's possible that she indulged in a little bit of blackmail on the side, which may have given one of these people a really good motive to kill her. This is the second of the Philo Vance mysteries written by Willard Huntington Wright, who adopted the name S.S. Van Dine as a pseudonym in order that these would not be confused with his other, more important writings. Ironically, of course, these are the books that he's remembered for today. He even placed Van Dine in the novels himself as a character, in fact as the Watson to Philo Vance's Sherlock Holmes, although it's fair to say that he's even less of a participant than Watson is in the Conan Doyle stories. Van Dine is merely an observer to all the action and takes no part in any of it at all, which does feel at times a little strangely contrived. Now, this is a locked room mystery, and it's a step up from the Benson murder case, which you may recall I actually read and reviewed shortly in a previous monthly reading roundup. And I was not impressed with that one at all, and in fact I seem to remember I stated that I was doubtful whether I would bother reading any more in the series. And it's possible that I wouldn't have if I hadn't found myself in circumstances where the only thing I had to read was books from my Kobo. Now, my main beef with the Benson murder case as a book, well, it was twofold really. The first was that I really did not like Vance as a character. I found him smug, arrogant, and really condescending. I just couldn't buy into someone who gives explanations out to the cops whilst quoting obscure French literary authors. It was very irritating indeed for me. Secondly, his detective methodology was to ignore physical evidence. And not just ignore it, but willfully discard it as misleading and unimportant, and instead concentrate on psychology as the way to trap the killer. And I couldn't help wonder how he would get on in today's world of forensic detectives and DNA, etc. It does seem a very old-fashioned, out-of-date and archaic notion. These problems are still present in the Canary murder case, but the author has toned things down quite a bit. Vance is not so grating, not quite so condescending, arrogant and smug. It's still there, but it's not quite so bad. Similarly, his spouting on about his ridiculous theories of detection are limited, mostly to a final scene, or a scene towards the end of the book, where he identifies the killer through the interesting method of playing poker with the three main suspects. This is how he psychologically profiles them, for want of a better term, and identifies who is the guilty party. It's plainly ridiculous, but it is really the only instance that really of this in the book. So all in all, it's a far more enjoyable experience than the Benson murder case. Now this brings us neatly on to the third book I want to talk about today, and that's The Greene Murder Case by S.S. Van Dine, which, surprise, surprise, is the third book of his Philo Vance mystery series. And I'm pleased to report that this is again a marked improvement on the previous entry. This time around, Vance accompanies his old friend District Attorney Markham to the mansion of the Greene family, an old New York family who've fallen on hard times a little bit after the death of their patriarch. Now, his strange will has condemned his children to live in the house for 15 years together before they can inherit any money. Now the eldest daughter, Julia, has been shot and killed, and the youngest adopted daughter, Ada, has been wounded by a gunshot just a few minutes later. The police believe that it's a robbery gone wrong, but Vance immediately realises that it's an inside job. Now this is by far the best of the series so far. And that's down mostly to Van Dine building on the improvements that he made with the Canary murder case. So there's far less of Vance pontificating about his odd methods of detection, and there's also far less of the annoying personality quirks that he exhibited, particularly in the first of the series. The mystery is also far more intriguing than before, although the book's major flaw is that the solution is wildly improbable. Many things have to occur in exactly the right way and exactly the correct circumstances in order for the killer to carry out their deeds and to get away with them, at least temporarily. None of it is remotely believable, although I must say, as you read the book, it is fairly entertaining, and Van Dine does conjure a really powerful atmosphere of moral decay within the Greene mansion, which speaks to far more skill as a writer than he's shown previously in the series. So it is probable that I'll get round to later entries, but possibly not really as a matter of priority. Now, getting round to the physical books I was able to read this month, let's start with one I've already done a video about, so I'm not going to speak at great length about this. This is Spirits of the Season, Volume 5 of the British Library's Tales of the Weird series, and featuring Christmas ghost stories. And I particularly wanted to include that in the video that I posted on Christmas Day, so if you want a full review of it, really go there and watch that video would probably be your best bet, because I'm not going to say much about it here, apart from the fact that I really felt it was probably one of the weakest I've read so far in the Tales of the Weird series. Not that it was bad, there was a decent solid standard of stories here, but just that it didn't quite have the number of standouts that some of the other volumes have had. My personal favourite was a story called The Christmas Shadrach by Frank R. Stockton, which I did think was both clever, smart, original and amusing, although that does kind of bring up my main problem with the volume in the fact that the editor rather chose humorous stories rather than chilling ones, which is perhaps I just wasn't quite in the mood for. I wanted something a bit more serious. But as I say, if you want a fuller review of this, please head to that video which I posted on Christmas Day. So next up we've got the Hammer Horror First Omnibus, or Film Omnibus should I say, the first Hammer Horror Film Omnibus even. This is by John Burke, and this was published in 1966 and features 4 novelisations of Hammer horror movies, and I read one from here, and that was The Curse of Frankenstein, which I'm sure if you know anything about Hammer you'll know was their first horror movie, the one that really set the whole trend for Hammer Horror and their success as a film studio in the late 50s, 60s and the first half of the 1970s. As I say, this is a novelisation by a writer called John Burke of the 1957 classic movie which kick-started the whole Hammer Horror brand and made stars of Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. And unsurprisingly, it's very faithful to the movie indeed, which I watched again before I read the book. Now, the fact that the studio published their own version of this tale as a novel might seem rather curious, because I do believe there was another book originally written quite a long time earlier by someone called Mary Shelley about the very same subject and telling, broadly speaking, the very same story. Now, the original Frankenstein was out of copyright, unlike Bram Stoker's Dracula, so why not simply slap a still from the movie on the cover of a reissue of it? Why bother to create your own version? Well, this brings up an interesting point, because there are 3 other novels in this volume, also written by John Burke: The Gorgon, Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, and The Revenge of Frankenstein, and I can find no record of any of these books being out in their own right previously before. So this is not, I feel, a collection of previously published works. This is a one-off individual project, with Burke writing all 4 novels for the purpose of this omnibus publication. Now, there was a previous paperback of The Revenge of Frankenstein, but it was not Burke's work. It was written by the screenplay author Jimmy Sangster and seems to have come out in 1958, concurrent with that movie's release. Now, why Hammer wanted that rewritten for this omnibus and didn't pick another movie to adapt instead, I have no idea. But then the selections for their films to be novelised does seem to be a very odd hit and miss selection. I can't quite work out why they picked the films they did. For example, in the second omnibus you get Dracula Prince of Darkness, but as far as I can tell there was never a novelisation of Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, nor was there one of Taste the Blood of Dracula, but there was one of Scars of Dracula, which is arguably the worst film in the series, at least in my opinion. So their selection of titles to novelise seems quite random. But back to The Curse of Frankenstein, and this is a fine novelisation, and it's written from the Baron's perspective, which allows us a little bit of a glimpse into the obsessive mindset and ruthlessness of his character. Now, there's no attempt to explain his psychology via something like a childhood trauma or anything. It's just who he is. You just have to accept it. But it does feel a little like a first draft of a novel in a way, in the fact you couldn't help feeling that some of those things would be expanded in later versions to allow for a more fully rounded reading experience. Now, one thing I did get from the book and from watching the movie again, which surprised me because I'd never really noticed it, was how small scale it all feels. For a start, the monster only leaves the castle once, a brief walkabout in the woods. It has consequences, of course, but it's only once, and there is also a very small cast of main characters. And this was obviously the result of a limited budget at the time, and it's a tribute to the movie and director Terence Fisher that this is the first time I've ever noticed it, and I only really noticed that after reading the book. But in the end, the book, for all its entertainment value, does feel a little truncated, limited, almost as if some of the more interesting parts might have been edited out, although I'm sure that's not the case. The aim of this project obviously was just to simply tell exactly the story that you see on the screen. Now, the main reason I only finished 6 books this month was not just to do with the circumstances of Christmas, but more to do with this: Vampires of the Andes by Henry Carew, a piece of Lost World literature which was published in 1923. Now, this is the tale of an English archaeologist called Will Wootton, and he's just made a major discovery in the jungles of Peru, a strange stone inscribed with unknown figures and letters. And he sends this stone back to England, to his old professor, Humphrey Sanderson, in the hope that the academic will be able to translate it. Meanwhile, Wootton is about to marry the beautiful Quita, who is the adopted daughter of a wealthy aristocratic Peruvian couple called the Del Piegos. Unfortunately, there are a couple of things that Will doesn't know anything about. And the first is that the stone is sacred to an ancient secret society who are still very active. And what's more, they've earmarked Quita, who is the last of the Inca princesses, it turns out, for a human sacrifice to resurrect their vampire gods at a ceremony that takes place only every 1,000 years. Now, given that kind of interesting plot and also the title, you might figure, as I did, that this is going to be a swift, pulpy read, a cartoon slice of adventure and fun, and what great larks I will have reading it. And no, it's not that at all. It's the exact opposite, in fact. This is a very serious-minded novel indeed, very dense with plot, information, and a multitude of characters. It's the sort of thing you can't put down and leave for a couple of days, because when you pick it up again, you might have trouble picking up all the threads and remembering who's who. It's also clear that Carew spent quite a lot of time in Peru or did an amazing amount of in-depth research, because there's a ton of information here about the geography of the country, its customs, its culture, its languages, its indigenous peoples, its folklore and mythology, which is crucial to the plot. It's all very impressive indeed, and isn't inserted in great lumps as if he's copied it out of an encyclopedia either. It seems more likely that it's coming from first-hand knowledge. So this book was never going to be a quick reading experience. However, about 2/3 of the way through, it gets extremely odd indeed, because it appears that a lot of this folklore and mythology that's been inferred throughout the tale, well, it's all true. And by the end of the book, we've met various ancient gods, phoenixes and all sorts of things, and it for me it completely jumped the shark and got so strange and odd that I really couldn't get on board with it at all, and it became a little bit of a slog to get through, I'll admit it. Now, your mileage for all this esoteric stuff may vary, of course, but as someone who's quite interested in folklore and mythology, I would have thought I was kind of the ideal audience for this. Unfortunately, I found it all to be a bit of a drag. To say not much is known about author Carew is an understatement. All that's known is that he's English, and he published one other novel previous to this one, which was called Secret of the Sphinx and was about a utopian society living under the Sahara Desert. Now, this was a book that had so much detail and so much plot that it demanded my best level of concentration for the reading experience, and I've got to say, after putting in that effort, I felt pretty cheated by the end of it. So that was my December reading experience. A bit of a disappointment, both in terms of quantity, but more importantly, in terms of quality. Certainly nothing stood out, at least not in a good way. Have you read any of these books? What did you think of them? What did you think of Vampires of the Andes? What did you make of it? I'd love to know, because I still don't know what to make of it myself. But thank you for staying with me through the end of this video. I really appreciate it. And please don't forget to like and subscribe and ring that notification bell if you're enjoying my content. And remember, please keep searching through those second-hand bookshops and those market stalls, because there are some treasures out there that only you can find. Cheers. See you in the next one.